On behalf of the New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, I welcome you to Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site here in Yonkers for today's presentation, Before Juneteenth, New York's Reluctance to End Slavery. My name is Michael Lord. I'm the site director here at Phillips Manor Hall, and with me today is Lavada Nahan, interpreter of African American history for the New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Also, a quick but meaningful welcome to Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, and a happy Father's Day to those who are here in our audience and those also watching online. So what is Juneteenth? Well, Juneteenth dates to June of 1865. Even though the Confederate Army had surrendered to the Union Army in April of 1865, enslaved people in Texas, the westernmost Confederate state, could not exercise their freedom until June 19, 1865. Now, on that date, Union General Gordon Granger led some 2,000 Union troops, many of whom were black, into Galveston Bay, where they announced that the more than 250,000 enslaved black people in the state of Texas were now free by executive decree. Now, this day came to be known as Juneteenth, deriving its name from combining June and 19th. Formerly enslaved people immediately sought to reunify families, establish schools, run for political office, and even sue slaveholders for compensation. Despite more than 200 years of enslavement, these individuals demonstrated extraordinary courage and resilience as they transformed both their lives and that of the country. Now, initially, Juneteenth was celebrated in family and church-centered gatherings, but over time, informal holidays evolved to include annual pilgrimages to Galveston Bay. These celebrations then spread across the South in the 1920s and the 1930s. What does Juneteenth have to do with New York? Well, very little from a historical perspective, but Juneteenth has always been more than just a holiday. The day stands as a testament to and a celebration of the unyielding spirit of a people. It is a day for introspection, a platform for education, and a tribute to the monumental contributions of African Americans to the history of this nation. For today's commemoration of Juneteenth, we will look back on New York's long walk to freedom. Before we can truly appreciate and celebrate the end of enslavement in New York, we need to acknowledge the tenacity, ingenuity, and resilience of those enslaved to counter the numerous roadblocks and detours that kept enslavement legal in New York for more than 200 years. In 1922, chemistry professor and African American folklorist Thomas Talley of Fisk University in Nashville published a version of this folk poem in his collection. Let's read this folk poem together, get an understanding of why it might be important. Promises of Freedom. My old mistress promised me when she'd die she'd set me free. She lived so long that her head got bald, and she gave out the notion of dying at all. My old mistress said to me, Sambo, I'm going to set you free. But when that head got sick and bald, the Lord couldn't have killed her with a big green maul. My old mistress never died, with her nose all hooked and her skin all dry. But my old miss, she's somehow gone, and she left Uncle Sambo's hilling up corn. My old master likewise promised me, when he'd die he'd set me free. But old master go and make his will to leave me plowing Old Beck still. Yes, my old master promised me, but his papers didn't leave me free. A dose of poison helped him along. May the devil preach his funeral song. This notion of dangling and then rescinding a promise of freedom to enslaved individuals is not unique to the 19th century, and it's not unique to the American South. This is a story as old as enslavement, and as we celebrate this federal holiday of Juneteenth, I'd like to provide a look into New York's many promises of freedom. In 1626, about a dozen or so African captives were delivered to the settlement of New Amsterdam. They were captured loot from a Spanish vessel. Many of their names suggest their nationality: Simon Congo, Paulo d'Angola, Peter San Tome. Now, this was a mere 2 years after the founding of New Netherland under the control of the Dutch West India Company. And since the Dutch West India Company had no laws at this point defining enslaved labor, these men were technically considered indentured servants, although the length of their indenture was never defined and it seemed to be permanent.
So slavery then, in this area, really began as a social custom, an informal practice, not yet codified. And there was no difference in that sort of interpretation of what enslavement was here in New Netherlands than it was, say, in Jamestown, Virginia, when the first African arrivals in 1619 were also considered permanent indentured servants, because Virginia also had no laws defining what or who an enslaved person was. Under Dutch rule here in New Netherlands, this unofficial form of slavery became referred to as a form of what we would call half freedom. It stems from a 1644 case where several of those first captives sued. Is that right?
Yes.
You're dying to say something.
I am. This is the problem of where do we start enslavement? Why indentured servants? The Dutch West India Company was made of members from Holland, a European country where slavery did not exist. One of the challenges I have around indentured servitude is the fact that I don't think that they were considered indentured. I think that they were suddenly considered property. Dutch privateers had been attacking Spanish and Portuguese ships, taking the cargo. Part of that cargo were Africans, some as sailors, others bound towards the slave trade in the bottom of what we would consider a slave ship. What happens when you are not from a culture with slavery, but yet you now have a booty that you can now sell to someone else? I think we are stepping into the period where a European country who does not have slavery begins the use of the law's lowest people in their society, which are indentured servants. And they begin to try to figure out what it means to own humans as property. Because as we go towards half freedom, please be clear, that only relies or applies to about 30 people. While those 30 people are considered half free, their children are not. Any children that they will have in the future are those that they currently have. Also, while they are living the privilege of half freedom, there are probably 300 other enslaved Africans in New Amsterdam, some of which are bound to chain gangs. We have enslaved people in Fort Orange, all in Rensselaerwyck. We have the beginning of enslavement in Kingston area, the area called Scopus. So when does slavery begin? For me, it is when one person sells another person for profit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So as Lovato was saying, these freedmen in these early years, they were awarded this idea of half freedom. And as Lovato said, it complicates the matter a little bit, because if you weren't enslaved to begin with, how could you be awarded half freedom afterwards? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. What happened in that 1644 lawsuit that some of these original Africans had sued the Dutch West India Company to end this permanent indentureship or customary enslavement, is that the Dutch West India Company did indeed award freedom to these individuals, freedom to their wives as well. But there were strings attached, significant strings attached. They had to specify an amount of produce each year to deliver back to the Dutch West India Company. So they were sort of tied to the land at that point. It was understood that their farms were situated just north of the city, as you can see in this image. This is basically an image taken right around New York University in Lower Manhattan. Those farms situated just north of the city served as a buffer zone for the most part, should English colonists from Connecticut choose to invade. And most importantly, the children, as Labata had mentioned, both those already in existence and those hereafter born, shall be slaves. So what kind of freedom indeed is this half freedom? If you pick up and move out of the colony, you leave your children behind. If you move within the colony, any future children that you're going to have will belong to somebody else as their slave. One cannot be half free or half slave. It just does not fit. Another promise of freedom, shortly after that, had to do with religion. The question, can a Christian enslave another Christian? One of the few things that Catholics and Protestants actually agreed upon at that time was that Christians cannot hold other Christians as slaves. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Europe went to war in the Crusades, to free Christians being held in bondage by Muslims who had captured the Holy Land. Now, although there were no laws restricting the captivity of Christians, the belief was strongly held that Christians should not be held in any kind of permanent captivity. Enslavers in New York struggled with this custom when their African captives expressed an interest in being baptized into the Christian faith. The Dutch West India Company said that enslaved parents would baptize their children in the hopes that the Dutch West India Company would not turn their children into slaves. But by the mid-1650s, the Dutch clergy had stopped actually baptizing enslaved children, and there was a rigid distinction put up between the slave religion and white religion at that point. It wasn't until after the English took over.
Go on.
All right, yeah. In 1664, that both churches in New York, both churches, there was an Anglican official church and a Dutch Reformed church, were engaging in converting non-Christians into their fold. It was commonly believed that reading the Bible to enslaved individuals would, quote, help pacify these individuals by promising a better life in the hereafter. By the 1680s, enslavers were again growing concerned about accepting their enslaved into the church. Would baptism alter the status of an enslaved person? Would a baptized slave essentially be able to be freed? Enslavers are torn between using the Bible to pacify their enslaved community or keeping that enslaved group ignorant of God's glory and abandoning the mission of the church. New York was under pressure from other English colonies like Virginia and Barbados, who had already written into their slave codes, expressly noting is what you see here, where some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owners made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should be virtue of their baptism be made free. It is enacted and declared by this grand assembly and the authority thereof, that the conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. So the law was written that baptism would not alter one's status.
Right. This is another conundrum. The Portuguese went into the Congo in the late 14th century. By the early 15th century, the king of Congo had converted to Christianity. The Dutch are trading out of Angola and Congo, where Christianity had existed for almost 200 years. We have within our collections artifacts that speak to the continuance of traditional African religions here in New York, both those coming out of the Congo and those coming out of the Yoruba area around what today is Nigeria. Is it because they are Catholic that the Dutch ignore the fact that some of the people that they may be enslaving were already Christian before they arrived? When we look at celebrations like Pinkster, which is Pentecost, the second major feast of the Christian year, do we ignore its African roots? Do we ignore the Congolese rite of Catholicism? Do we ignore all of the sketches that we have of Christian priests, be they Catholic, not Protestant, spreading their faith? Do we ignore the letters from the King of Congo asking the King of Portugal about why he's treating so badly after he had sent his young men into Rome and into Portugal to become priests? The names of those initially enslaved speak to the presence of Congolese and Angolans in Europe before they come here. Again, a time for us to consider what is being ignored.
Thank you. Next clause, next loophole as well. Enslaved individuals by the Phillips family were affected by various promises of freedom that never materialized. In 1730, the will of Catherine Phillips, the widow of Frederick, yes, that's right, the widow of Frederick Phillips I had died in 1730. She leaves a will that divides up all of her possessions amongst her children. She also made the decision to manumit or to free 2 enslaved women and their children. The will of Catherine Phillips reads, this is basically a small excerpt of it, but I will direct that Molly and Sarah, my Indian or Mustee slaves, shall be manumitted and set at full freedom and liberty 1 month after my decease. Catherine's executors were responsible for carrying out her wishes as expressed in her will. However, there seems to be a problem here because the colony of New York had enacted a law as early as 1712 and then reiterated again in 1730 that made restrictions on any enslaver who wanted to manumit or free an enslaved person. This law reads, and be it further enacted that if any master or mistress shall manumit and set at liberty any Negro, Indian, or mulatto slave, such master or mistress shall do and enter into a bond unto his majesty's heirs a sum not less than 200 pounds to keep and save such Negro, Indian, or mulatto slave from becoming or being any charge to the city. And if security not be given in manner as aforesaid, it's a lot of legalese, such manumission or device as before mentioned shall be void. Basically, if you can't put up a 200-pound bond for each individual that you choose to manumit, it's not going to happen.
And current research says it may not have been happening anyway. One of the issues about reading a lot of things is I forget where I saw something, but Governor Dugan wrote to the Board of Trade that many of the executors were in fact pocketing the bond and selling the enslaved person. That money was supposed to go to the colony. He needed that money for support. Again, a promise given but not delivered.
Exactly. Next promise. Here's a big one that we probably will recognize. The promise of freedom that came with the American Revolution? Or even question, was there a promise of freedom when the colonies declared their independence from England? Right? In the spring and early summer of 1776, the Continental Congress gets around to issuing this formal Declaration of Independence. We know about Thomas Jefferson's famous words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lofty goals. And one that as a country we are still struggling with. Now, of course, in Jefferson's day, just to reiterate here, that term men, as in all men are created equal, was much narrower than our definition of men today. Jefferson's notion of men were white Christians, males over the age of 21 with land and property. Poor whites with no land, free persons of color, Catholics, and women didn't count. Enslaved men weren't even considered men in the eyes of the law. They were considered property. So neither Jefferson nor the signers of the Declaration really had any problem with this term, all men being created equal, because it was such a narrow focus. But of the 56 signers of that Declaration of Independence, right, 41 were slave owners. And 40% of those were slaveholders in the North. And they included, I'll give you some, big guy in the middle, right, John Hancock from Massachusetts, very wealthy guy, he was an enslaver. The guy down here, Benjamin Franklin, you might have heard of him too, Pennsylvania man, an enslaver. And these two rectangles represent the 9 men who signed the Declaration of Independence representing the state of New York and the state of New Jersey. How many of them were enslavers out of those 9? All of them. Every single one. Right? Kind of puts this into perspective to see our country's birth certificate essentially in this light. So our original document of freedom was yet another false promise that changed nothing for the enslaved at the birth of this new nation. 3 years later, in 1779, the British took a big step towards freeing any rebel-owned slave during the American Revolution who could make it to British lines. Issued by Sir Henry Clinton, the general commander-in-chief of all of His Majesty's forces, Clinton, while headquartering right here in this building at Phillips Manor Hall in June of 1779, issues the Phillipsburg Proclamation, which was arguably this nation's first emancipation proclamation, albeit issued by our enemy. It guaranteed freedom to any rebel-owned slave who could make it into British-held territory, not just those who could fight, but men, women, and children as well. The British did not offer freedom for humanitarian reasons. They were also slaveholders, but they understood that such a disruption of American labor and the threat of losing private property might keep those individuals who were on the fence from siding with rebels. And despite losing the war, the British kept their promise to free those who ran to the crown. Americans protested bitterly over the loss of what they considered their private property, but when the last British soldiers sailed out of New York Harbor in November 1783, it was estimated somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 ex-slaves left with them. Another 10 to 15,000 in total may have left from other ports in the colony: Charleston, Norfolk, Savannah, Baltimore. Ironic how freedom and liberty really meant siding with a loyalist cause from the perspective of the enslaved point of view. While that Phillipsburg Proclamation might not have been issued with an altruistic eye towards ending slavery, the effect of its terms were undeniable. It offered the enslaved individuals and their families a credible choice between sort of this vague promise of American liberty and independence and the practical policy of this British freedom. And it should be no surprise that thousands of enslaved ran to those British side with that Phillipsburg Proclamation. And because the Phillips family were loyalists themselves, those whom they enslaved here at Phillips Manor Hall were not eligible to find freedom with the British. British only wanted to disrupt the livelihoods of those who were in rebellion to the crown.
New York history is all over this. Evacuation Day. One of the most important documents in our colonial New Nation period is the Book of Negroes. That ship left from New York. We also want to pay homage to those Southern slaves who ran to the British lines, who loaded numerous ships, but in fact never left the harbor. Smallpox swept through those ships, and they all perished. When we look at those here enslaved by the Phillips, in researching the exhibit that we currently have, we learned that even though some of the enslaved went with the Phillips family into the city, there were others who did not. When the land was confiscated, all of those enslaved that were left here were supposed to have been freed. We learned that 2 men were in fact sold by the Commissioner of Forfeiture. We also learned that there were several elders. They were deemed unfit, something that the enslaved will always have to prove if they are to be freed in New York, that they are not a burden, that they can take care of themselves, that they are profitable. 3 elders were in fact boarded out, and we found the documentation that spoke to their boarding, their dying, and their burial.
You read my mind. It's right up there. We got, yes, between the 1777 and about 1813, we have references to enslaved individuals of the Phillipses, 2 of whom were sold, George and Pompey, in 1777 and 1778, after they were confiscated by American forces. And then 5 others, Tom, Mary, Betty, Caesar, and Wall, who were found in various records from various, let's see, it was the overseers of the port, where their maintenance costs were listed in these books for a period of about 15 or 20 years, and as well as Levada had noted as well, burial costs also. So yes, New York also countered that Phillipsburg Proclamation with this promise to free slaves from Loyalists, but it doesn't seem to have happened on a regular basis, and anybody who was old or infirm ended up being part of the overseers of the poor. Now, Levada's got a lot to talk about with gradual emancipation.
That's what she. Gradual emancipation. We hear that term, Emancipation Proclamation. We think everybody's suddenly free. So we know those people in Texas were a little behind, but two messengers were sent and they never arrived. But what happens in New York? New York will go through a almost 15-year debate and process. All of it is to support the enslaver, those that are owned. There are two pieces of legislation that will pass. The first is the 1799 Gradual Manumission Act. The second will happen in 1817, and that's the Gradual Emancipation Law. So, 1799, any child born to an enslaved woman after July 4th, 1799 was deemed free. But that child would have to serve the mother's enslaver until they were 28 if they were male and 25 if they were female. The enslaver of such child could choose to abandon any child born of a mother after July 4th, 1799, by notifying the clerk of the city or town where they lived. They had to register the birth. Failure to register the birth by age 1 would cost the enslaver 3 to 7 years of service of that person. The servant then would be bound out by the overseers of the poor until they reach the age of 21. Confusing. 1, by law, you have to register a birth, right? July 4th, 1799, any child born there or later, you have to register the birth. At the time of registration, the owner has a choice. They can keep the enslaved child straight as their property, or they could abandon that child to the overseers of the poor. Now, the overseers of the poor are established early when the colony sets in. Social care for those who were infirmed or aged or harmed, or children who was orphaned because of their parents had died or something else had happened to them. The colony took care of them, and that was the rule for, or the purpose for, the overseers of the poor. In terms of the enslaved, it is the overseers of the poor who will determine if an enslaved person is fit enough to remain as property, or if they're deemed unfit, then the enslaver has to take care of them for the rest of their lives. The overseers of the poor come in strongly into the freeing and ending of slavery. So a child born, they're registered, I don't want this person anymore. They're given to the overseers of the poor. This child is 1 year old. The overseers of the poor then gives the child back to the enslaver, but they're no longer considered an enslaved person. They are considered an indentured servant. But they have to serve that person, their mother's enslaver, until male 28, female 25. But here's the catch. They get paid for it. $3.50 a month. They will be paid to take care of a child that they just abandoned and got back. But it gets a little expensive. So March 26, 1802, the fee is reduced to $2 a month and will only be paid until the child is 4 years old. March 31st, 1804, they get rid of the payment altogether. But the child, the person, is still bound to the enslaver. At that point, the enslavers are required to teach the children to read well enough to read the Holy Scripture by the time they are age 21. Please note, there are no literacy laws in New York's enslaved code. At no point in the 200 years that enslavement happens here is an enslaved person denied the right by law to read or write. That's why we have Sojourner Truth, who is illiterate, Jupiter Hammond, who is a published poet, both of whom are enslaved in New York. Then we get to 1817 and the gradual emancipation law. Children of enslaved mothers born between 1799 and March 31st, 1804 would continue to be provided for at the expense of the state according to existing laws. They sort of got grandfathered in. Enslavers had to teach their servants who owed them service to read by now age 18, or to give them 4 quarters of schooling. This is during the period that the New York Manumission Society will open their free school, and other free schools will start to happen around the community, around the colony. All children of either sex born to enslaved mothers after March 31st, 1817, and before July the 4th, 1827, were to be freed at the age of 21. All slaves born before July 4th, 1799, would be freed on July 4th, 1827. So, a child born to an enslaved mother on July the 3rd, 1827, could be kept as an indentured servant until July the 3rd, 1848. But we know that the last person was 1842. Although current research says there may have been 2 people, a woman in Putnam County and a man around Bethlehem, New York, and Albany County, I believe it's Albany County, who were never freed.
Wow.
So when we say on July 5th, 2027, we will be celebrating or commemorating the legal end of enslavement, but not the freeing of all those held in bondage. One day you're a slave, the next day you're an indentured servant, same house, same owner, same job.
So, yeah, this union of democracy and tyranny was continued in the United States clearly after gradual emancipation and gradual manumission in 1827, as LaVaugh noted. Now, of course, we know slavery continues to be legal in states below the Mason and Dixon line, but up north, gradual emancipation was continuing to be a painfully slow process. Slavery wasn't constitutionally abolished in Rhode Island until 1842, lasted in Connecticut until 1848. So it was continuing to go on here in many different guises. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln takes effect on January 1st, 1863. That proclamation declares that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforward and shall be free. Kind of reads a little bit like the Phillipsburg Proclamation a number of years earlier. Despite this promise, the Emancipation Proclamation was pretty limited in many ways. It applied only to states that had seceded from the United States, leaving slavery untouched in those border states that remained in the Union. That was Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. Also exempted parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Northern control. So the only way really to free people in the Emancipation Proclamation, that promise, would be to defeat the Confederacy, which is kind of what the Union was trying to do since 1861. That defeat did come with the surrender of General Lee's army at Appomattox in April 65. more than 15 months after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was issued. But news travels slow. The war ravaged South. It wasn't until the reason why we're here on June 19th, 1865, that parts of coastal Texas heard about the Confederacy had surrendered and slavery was abolished. This act kind of marks the end of the war and the end of enslavement in Texas. But Juneteenth was not the end of slavery in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation stated that it would end enslavement in the Confederate States, but not those slaveholding border states that remained in the Union. Although Maryland abolished slavery in 1864 and Missouri abolished it in January of 1865, Kentucky and Delaware did not abolish slavery until they ratified the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. And that's what we're reading crookedly here. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, then there was New Jersey. I live in New Jersey. Like New York, New Jersey enacted a gradual Emancipation Act that was supposed to end enslavement in 1846. But the 1860 federal census, this is just a small piece of that federal census, notes 44 people still enslaved in New Jersey in 1860. Slavery's legal death in New Jersey actually occurs on January 23rd, 1866, after the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Governor Marcus Ward of New Jersey signs a state constitutional amendment that brought about an end to slavery in that state a month after the 13th Amendment, because New Jersey needed another month to think about it. So the institution of slavery in New Jersey survives 7 months after the Juneteenth Declaration of Freedom in Texas.
It is a long, long, ugly road.
1626 to 1866 gives us 240 years of promises until freedom is fully attained. And freedom is not the same as equality. We're not even going to get into that today. Promises made and promises denied. Enslaved individuals exploited loopholes with baptism, with manumission, but those loopholes were closed. Even 4 years of civil war and the ratification of the 13th Amendment wasn't enough for New Jersey. They still needed that other month. So even if Juneteenth has very little to do, sort of historically speaking, with the ending of enslavement in this area, we still need this day to pause for a moment and remember the long and hard-fought struggle to end enslavement in this nation.
But this also gives us an opportunity to look at the links that many New Yorkers will retain with the Caribbean and West Indies. So although they are not holding people here, they are holding people there. It will be a long time before the sugar plantations in Jamaica that take money into Hyde Hall State Historic Site will cease. It is a long time before Brazil ends enslavement. It is a long time before links that began in the very early years of the colony of New Netherland will be severed.
Thank you, guys. Sarah's handling all of our online questions, but we also, if we have offline questions, do we need to?
Folks who are online, I'm going to give you a minute if you want to type anything in the chat. I'm going to go peruse the audience in person here and see if anybody has a question.
Cocktail host kind of thing.
This little microphone is so folks who are online can hear your questions. So does anybody have a question? Yeah.
Hi, can we hold it? Or, okay. One of the things that's coming up a lot as we start preparing in the state for the 250th anniversary of the revolution and is a lot of confusing conversation sort of talking about the importance of the participation of Black people, free Black people, and enslaved people fighting for the side of the rebels. Very little is being talked about those who fought on the side of the loyalists. To me, it's a really important, and it's complicated because why did people choose each side? There is some conversation that that some enslaved people thought that they would be more likely, because of promises that were made, to get freedom from the rebel side, and others thought that they would be freer on the other side. And then, of course, there was the fact that they were enslaved people, so they had to do some things and were forced to do some things, or had families. I'm very interested in whether or not either of you or you know of folks who are really involved in sort of pulling that piece apart, because I think there are underlying historical interpretations that sort of speak to what side you emphasize. And I think it's important to unpack that. So that's a lot, but love to hear from you.
Well, I want to say in the circles that parks are involved in, both sides are being discussed. So perhaps that is just locally, but on the state level and the conversations that I have had privy to speak to with both Travis Bowman, who is heading up for the Parks Department, our Rev War, and the state historian, Devin Lander, people are looking at both sides. And ultimately, personally, I want to say that that individual decision is very much like the indigenous have to make. Who can you trust after having so many things, promises broken, lies given, half-truths said? One has to then follow, I believe, their individual conscience. I think that it would be wonderful for us to want to just step out there and speak for all of those who went to the loyalist side, or all of those who went to the patriot side, and the why or the why not. But that actually has a lot to do with, I believe, where they are enslaved in the state. We really skew the story of enslavement to the southern part of the state. But you must remember, there's Kingston, there's large populations in Albany. There's a larger population of just body count, enslaved person in Albany than there is in Brooklyn. We often refer to percentages, and yes, the percentage is larger because the European amount is smaller, but there's a whole lot of people up in Albany. There's a whole lot of people above that in the Mohawk River Valley. And so where do you go? Where can you go? Because at this point, even for those in the upper part of the state, there's still slavery in Canada, right? So you have limited outs. So who makes what choice? I think that there are a lot of things that fall on that. I believe that we will never know fully what that individual choice is, because I think that as much as we want to be scholars and put our stuff in there, the bottom line is each individual man has to look at his life and say, what is best for me? What is best for my family? What are best for all concerned? So it is being discussed. Both sides are being discussed. But ultimately, as I said, I believe that is individual choice. But a lot of that overarching conversation, we really also have to look at where the enslaved are in the state.
Thank you both for your presentation. We are I'm interested because of my predecessors in the legislature and what happened just before we left. We voted to get rid of any enslavement in our prisons. That obviously was based very much on what was in our Constitution in this Amendment 13, as well as both houses are forming a reparations commission should the governor sign it, because we know that New York's history, like, everyone else's, is steeped in enslavement. But I was wondering, with the gradual emancipation, when was there, or was there some legislation that just ended that completely? Because, as you said, it went from enslavement to some sort of half-free situation, which no one can actually understand, to some kind of. So how did that end?
Well, the law of 1817 actually was designed to give a date for the legal end, but it also was crafted to project that 1848 date. So they never wanted it clear cut. They wanted to take the best years of a bondsperson's life. So initially, there was a whole debate around when to actually let people be free, right? And some people wanted that age limit extended till they were in their 40s. So it was a big back and forth. But if you read the papers around 1817, that law was crafted with that projected date in mind. So that wasn't happenstance, that was purposeful.
It was really, as I'm sure you know, Senator Stewart Cousins, that the adoption of those three federal amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that put a period, a dot at the end of this notion of enslavement in America, with the 13th supposedly ending enslavement to anyone who was not a criminal, but that didn't go far enough. They needed the 14th Amendment to ensure that former enslaved individuals, freedmen, now had the right of being a citizen of the United States, which made a very big difference. And then the 15th Amendment allowing freedmen the right to vote after that inception in 1870. Those three Reconstruction era amendments are really mark the final death knell to enslavement in the United States. So all states had to actually obey those three amendments.
And that's one of the things that is important for us to remember as we relearn the period of enslavement in New York. One, it happened, and it happened in a very big way. And it's more than just the physical bodies of the people. New York's economy is bound to the transatlantic trade. Most of the wealthy old families in New York own property in the Caribbean and West Indies. We are a state founded by merchant traders. These are international traders, and when they're not trading here, they're trading somewhere else. We are so used to cotton and sugar being the touted cash crops that we forget wheat. New York's wheat went directly, most of it, for years and years and years to the West Indies and Caribbean to feed the enslaved there. That shift in economy really does not happen well until we get through the Revolutionary War, because so many of the wheat fields are burned out. So then there has to be a reconsideration of how do we make our money. And at that point, that's when the wheat that had been in the lower Hudson Valley goes up into the Mohawk, goes up into central and western New York, because as the native lands are reclaimed for the horrific Sullivan campaign and the burning out of the indigenous, those lands are used as payment to soldiers. And they start the wheat industry up in that land, up in area is some of the richest land of the state. And that is the same time that Erie Canal is happening and all of that is opening up. So we have to shift where we're going to get money for the state, right? Because after the war, we're broke. Right? That's why they're confiscating the land so fast. That's why they're selling things, even when Congress doesn't want them to do that, because the people have to be paid. Right? So our economy, so we lose the labor force with the ending of slavery, but we also start to lose the baseline of New York's economy. As enslavement ends, right? That's why when we go into Reconstruction, you know, New York is sticking out there because we are supporting then the beginning of the cotton factories that will come up and down the Hudson River, right? Because our major base of our economy is gone. So we need something else. So we're going to support those cotton plantations, even though we say we don't want to, right? You know, we're all liberal, and you know that's not happening in my backyard anymore. But our economy is tied heavily to the slave trade, both in our nation and in our hemisphere for a very long time.
So I have a couple of questions online that are related to economics, and then we'll go back, and then we'll come back online, okay? So Melissa said, would you say the economics of labor is the presiding force then and now for involuntary servitude and enslavement?
I can't make that leap. I can't. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. So, because I have to say, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question yet because my delving into the economy is recent. This came up in a conversation I had with Dr. Andrea Mosterman in interviewing her with her book, Spaces of Enslavement. In her book, she says, New York is almost, but not a society, a slave society, that we are a society with slaves. But she says, you know, she lays it all out. It looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walk, you know, all that like a duck, but we're not that duck, right? That was put out there by the scholar, Dr. Ira Berlin, years ago. And I asked her, why does she feel that way? Because for me, we are a slave society. Her response to my question was, it's a tie to the economy. I am not an economist, so I can't speak on that. And my brain went off, the worm started digging the hole, and I have been in that hole for 2 years. Because what it is doing is really helping me to see the bigger picture of the institution of slavery, not just the physical bodies. So I'm in a learning phase, and I'm learning a lot. And pushing back just a little bit more and a little bit more. But so I don't, thank you, but I don't feel I'm there yet.
Melissa has a follow-up.
Uh-oh, the follow-up.
It's not, it's just she found, so she says, she posits it's economics. She says, it pained me to recently locate a claim of a Kentucky slave owner who filed a claim for his former slave in 1866, and the federal government paid him $300 for his slave who had just completed 3 years of Union cavalry service in 1866. The Emancipation Proclamation meant nothing to the enslaved or owners in Kentucky, a Union border state. So,
All right. Well, that's Kentucky was a border state, and Kentucky was protected from the Emancipation Proclamation because it was a border state. So the Union apparently felt that they needed to pay this or reimburse this person for the loss of his, quote, property / labor for those 3 years that this person was fighting. So this isn't, I'm not surprised, let's put it that way. The United States was still going to, and Lincoln had said that he would protect this union even if it meant keeping slavery. So this is sort of one of those examples, I would imagine, that the United States in a border state is going to protect the rights of those enslavers over the enslaved.
And that's one of the things that made ending enslavement here difficult, was who was going to pay for the loss. That loss of labor, you know, is comes up time and again.
oh, another question from the audience.
Thank you. I think you did a great job explaining sort of the gray area when slaves were free but not free, or about to be free in New York. And in Texas, right after that Gideon Granger order, the very next order was one that said that these ex-slaves could not leave the plantation without proof of employment elsewhere. And of course, because they couldn't leave the plantation, they could never get employment elsewhere. And so this system of enslavement by another name continued for way too long. But so my question is, in New York, were we aware of that at all in the years following? And did anybody care?
We are definitely aware. One of the things that we negate is newspapers. And New York is a major player internationally. So reading historic newspapers, you learn a lot. You learn a lot. So yes, I'm sure it showed up in the newspapers. I can't imagine that it wouldn't.
Yeah, those kinds of rules, most of what we've been talking about are these various loopholes that get developed and then closed because somebody figures out a way to get around something. We see those laws go into effect in numerous places. I'm not exactly aware off the top of my head what may have been happening in those gray areas here as well as with what would happen in Texas. But none of it surprises me. Most is what Levada had said before. These gradual emancipation acts were enacted in order to protect the enslaver, not necessarily to free the enslaved and give them a living and a wage and a job, but to suck 27 or 28 years out of a person's life to work for somebody else before they're allowed to be, quote, freed from that indentureship. This is designed in order to protect the profit of the enslaver.
It is, one of the things that we often don't consider, the economic structure of capitalism is being established during the colonial period. Somebody's at the top, but somebody must be at the bottom. I was recently reading Sinclair's The Jungle, and that comes up in that book. And he is very clear that the new wave of immigrants is replacing chattel slavery. This structure that our economy is based on is something that person at the bottom we are struggling with to this day. That is the whole relevance and conversation around our immigration policy. As much as people fight back about immigrants coming in, a whole lot of people that need jobs in the United States are not going picking fruit, right? They don't want to be in that bottom position. This is one of the things when we look at the institution of slavery and American history, United States history, and we want to look at our economic growth over the years, that structure is set by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century. We are capitalists, particularly here in New York. We are started by a company, and the company rules with an iron hand. So that whole structure plays into how we go forward. So letting the enslaved go, the labor force that built this country, letting those people go is a huge deal. It's a huge deal. It will affect every major commodity we put on the world market.
I actually have a related comment, sorry, about economics from Peter Bunton, who is joining us virtually. He says, on the issue of the slave economy, the dilemma facing many Quakers is instructional. In New York, Quakers in Dutchess County led the way in trying to outlaw slaveholding in their meetings, but it took over 30 years to achieve it. However, even when many Quakers decided to get rid of their slaves, the slave economy still existed. For example, Josiah Brown and his three brothers forswore slavery, but their shipping business continued to involve them deeply in the Atlantic triad. Is that what it means?
Yes, the triad.
Triad business, specifically in moving cotton and other goods made by or serving slave colonies, etc. So the bigger question facing Josiah and others was, what does it mean to be anti-slavery?
Right. And for many people, the fact that Quakers were enslavers is new, but New York is full of Quaker enslavers. including Sylvester Manor out in Shelter Island here in the Hudson River Valley. The clarifying of the placement of the institution of slavery in the colony of New Netherland and New York is allowing us really to correct a lot of myths. And one is that the Quakers were always anti-slavery. That is not true. Also, many of them, although anti or abolitionists, they're also colonizationists. And that's something we haven't even touched on, is that Lincoln, too, ship them out, get them out of here, right? Also shows up in the newspapers, right? So a lot of our history, and this is why gateways like Juneteenth, allowing us the opportunity to pick up a book for the summer. You know, you can start with a light one, but every quarter, pick up another book. How much can you relearn between now and Black History Month? How much can you just step into the subject and have an opportunity to have something to share in those conversations during Black History Month, as opposed to trying to cram it all in?
So we have a couple people online who've been waiting very patiently. I'm sorry, Judith, we'll get to you. Lorna asks, have you come across any records showing that New York enslavers were illegally selling enslaved people to southern states after 1799?
Oh, there is the case of Sojourner Truth and her son.
Yeah, and even before with Liss on Long Island, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, it did. And one of the, well, there are a couple of things. One, there was a push to get people to personally manumit, like do it on your own. But we know in the discussions in the legislature that that was one of the things that came up, was that clause to be able to sell an unruly slave out of the state. So that was part of the whole discussion around when do we stop selling people? Do we sell within state? What, you know, but we've got this guy we want to get rid of, because that's how they got rid of people both in the 1712 and 1741 insurrection. After those that were tortured, a number of them were sold. So that was all part of the flow. Thank you. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, so Mary Beth is asking about the choices that enslaved people made during the American Revolution regarding promises and timing of reward or freedom. So she says, let's see. What is the documentary evidence of the enslaved's understanding? Can you comment on the evidence regarding the perception of the enslaved person regarding promises and timing of reward or freedom advantage? Time to reward, what evidence that they see choices with different return or timing on the choice?
One more time?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm
confusing. I think she's asking is if there is documentary evidence for enslaved people choosing one way or the other in the American Revolution, what was influencing their decisions?
There are some documents. We have a recording of one, but that gentleman was in fact from the South coming here. I can't off the top of my head recall any, but I don't remember documents in particular that way.
And it's very difficult to have any written evidence that is A, just survived the years, and B, that is written specifically by enslaved individuals or having a debate with themselves about which side to choose or what are the actions that one would take. It's very dangerous to leave that kind of written evidence
they don't
around,
journals.
especially if you're going against your enslavers' idea as to which side they're going to choose. So I would imagine a lot of these debates were taking place in the quarters with family members, but definitely not something that's going to be written down.
And this is one of those things too. There's sometimes we just have to let go of the documents because they don't exist. We want a certain level of that personal agency to be the written word, and it's just not there. I mean, for us to find any written document by an enslaved person is great. And most of the narratives actually happen after the period of that person being enslaved. Generally, they are somewhere safe, like they're in Canada once Canada ends enslavement, or they are then on the other side of manumission or emancipation, so they can then write that history. But we have very little written information from the enslaved themselves in period.
Judith has been waiting so patiently, so I will come and get her to ask her a question.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I think in this brief hour, you crystallize so much of the history that has been whitewashed in the past. It has been a profound presentation, and I have a question for you. Why has it taken this long for this level of scholarship to be available, which clearly punctures and kind of pierces a veil that we would say about historical myths?
Because people have to do the work. It takes a long time, and I credit a lot of it, this movement, particularly around New York history, to Dr. Charles Gehring and his translating of thousands of documents with Dr. Jana Venema and the team at New Netherlands Project, the team at New Netherlands Institute, where first, can we just get to the Dutch part, right? But also, I want to be clear. This research is happening all over the state of New York. And I want to be very, very clear about that. I cannot tell you how proud and how privileged and just overwhelmed I am wherever I go to have a county historian, a town historian, someone from a historic society, a church, a museum, or looking at their own family are doing the same thing. They're going back with fresh eyes into the documents. We are so deep in the documents in New York, it's not even funny. And I am privileged and so proud of us all, because every day somebody is discovering a person. Somebody is discovering people, numbers. You know, names are great, but the numbers, oh my gosh. And because we are willing to do the work, we are having conversations with each other, and those conversations are making us more curious and spiraling us into more wormholes and more boxes of thousands of documents that nobody's ever looked at. And oh, we need to get this translated and this transcribed, and it is fabulous. I don't care how long it has taken us to get here. I am grateful that we are here. We are doing the work. Everyone is doing the work. And that is what is important for me. It's not about looking backwards. It's about how do we live with today? What can I discover today? What can I use and learn today to push me to tomorrow? In fact, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine, Travis Bowman. I went in there because I'm trying to learn the upper part of the colony and the upper part of the state. He, in a conversation, realized he had a woman named Marie Van Schenck on the census with her foreign slave person. But she was a recent widow. He also had the former husband's will. He went back and looked at the will, and suddenly he is seeing all of these enslaved people a year before that this man owned, but they weren't given to the wife. They were given to the daughters, they were given to the sons, and here we thought they only had 4. At the end of the conversation, they had almost 12. Last week, I was at historic Huguenot Street. I think it was at historic Huguenot Street, somewhere. The county person, historian from Delaware County, came up, oh, it was in Kingston, came up and gave me a printout that she had been compiling of all of the enslaved on the census records in Delaware County. And guess what? 1820, right before gradual manumission, highest number. Every household Every household in those 3 towns that represented that county had enslaved people. A year ago, unknown information. This is where we are. This is how we're growing. This is how we're learning. This is how we are preparing for Emancipation 200. We're in the documents. We're doing the work. I encourage everybody, enjoy Juneteenth, June 5th, June 20th, go back into New York's documents.
Any last questions in person? I am going to ask one last one, even though he told me I didn't have to because I think it's interesting. This is from John. Given that New York and New Jersey are so close, both geographically and commercially, how was the freedom of Black New Yorkers upheld in New Jersey before slavery was abolished there?
Ooh.
The opposite question applies as well. Was the enslavement of people living in New Jersey upheld while conducting business in the free state of New York?
So always debates as to how each state handles the legitimacy of their own laws once you cross those state lines. I don't know, and I won't even pretend to give you a real answer as to how commerce crossed those lines and whether or not free person or enslaved persons in New Jersey cross the Hudson. What does that mean once they come in here? I do know that many states did have laws that respected the laws of the other states. So out west and other places, an enslaved person crosses into a free state, they're still enslaved. They do not have, and the Dred Scott decision of 1857 certainly proves that you do not have that right to declare freedom just by crossing a state line. How's that work between New York and New Jersey? I should look that up because that's a good question.
I don't know, but this is the period where we start with the Underground Railroad. This is the period because of the large communities of freed, enslaved, formerly enslaved here in New York, that somebody from Jersey could show up. Doesn't mean they're going back. They showed up at Cataract House in Niagara Falls. Didn't mean they went back. Somebody came from Haiti, brought their enslaved people, and there was a riot in New York City. So you can bring them. The law may respect them. The community may have something else to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Lavada and
Thank
Michael.
you all.
Thank you for questions.
Thank you.
Folks online, I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. Folks in person, if you want to stick around, you can.